I feel almost daunted by the task that stands before me. I've been wanting to review this game for some time, basically since I did my very first reflective review, for reasons that will become quickly apparent. But unlike most of the games I review, this is a game that is very well known, very well received, very well liked, very well reviewed. This is a game that I've never heard a bad review of. This is a game that I've never heard it's a love it or hate it thing. This is a game that everyone's heard of. I talked briefly in last week's review of Modern Warfare about the difference between mainstream and popular within a series, right? For example, to go to the exact same example I used last time, Deep Space Nine among Star Trek fans is generally considered to be one of the best shows of the series, whereas most people who are not sci-fi fans or not Star Trek fans have heard of The Next Generation, you know, Picard and Kirk and Data and Spock, have not heard of Cisco or Kira or Odo, right? That's the difference. There's always this special something extra, whether it's good or bad, to push something into the mainstream. This is a mainstream game. This is a game that when it came out, re-release on the DS, one of the ad campaigns was simply a white screen that just said "Good morning, Chrono," and people figured it out. People knew what it was. You didn't have to do it. You know, and so I'm going to try very hard not to do what every other review in the world has done and just gush about how incredible the game is, which I could do very easily. I think the fact that I'm going to summarize my gushing as best as I can in a few sentences here in a moment, and I'm going to try to just talk about the whys and the wherefores and the reasons behind why this is such a fantastic game, rather than just be like, oh, it's amazing, it's amazing. Now, my summary for why I think this is incredible is most people of video game genres, especially of people who like RPGs, tend to agree that Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger are the two best games ever made. At the very least, at the bare minimum, they're the two best RPGs ever made, right? It's important because just about everyone agrees on this point. Now, some people tend to disagree which one actually deserves the number 1 or the number 2 slot. Some people think they're equal, you know, whatever. I personally think Final Fantasy VI is better. But to me, Final Fantasy VI, as I mentioned in my very first reflective review, is a work of art that is unmatched and unparalleled by any video game I've ever played, ever before or since. But the best thing I could see about Chrono Trigger is it's the only game that has approached it, ever. It is the only game that has actually managed to challenge Final Fantasy VI for the number 1 slot. It didn't win, obviously. It didn't get actually quite that high, but you get the general concept. Now, Chrono Trigger... where to begin? Chrono Trigger came out in the mid to early 90s. And this was, I mentioned that because this was before Square Enix existed. There was still Squaresoft, and there was still Enix over there. And the two had come together. I'm still not sure who approached who first, and they got several of the development teams from both staffs and said, let's make a game together. And they called it the Dream Team, and it seemed like a match made in heaven. You know, the best of the Dragon Quest series with the best of the Final Fantasy series combined, making one game, right? Oh my god. And for obvious reasons, it was rather hyped up in Japan, because we didn't hear much about it over here at this time, because Dragon Quest barely existed in the States at this point in time. But over in Japan, and to this day, Dragon Quest is one of the most widely popular and accepted, gaming series ever, right? And so this was considered to be a really big deal. Now, one of the other things that really sells it for this game is that there was an individual named Yasunori Mitsuda, who was a sound programmer, and he insisted, he was basically demanding to be able to compose, finally. He wanted to actually write music for a game. And so they agreed on the stipulation that Nobuo Uematsu, you know, the master, would be watching over his shoulder the whole time. And almost every song, with like 3 or 4 exceptions in the game, that Yasunori made were made with Nobuo's help. And it shows. The song style is very similar to Nobuo Uematsu's overall style, and you could tell that, and you get the feel of that. And it really worked out well. I mentioned earlier the whole mainstream versus gamer thing. I personally am one of a decently large number of people who prefer video game music. You know, I actually like listening to video game songs. 99% of my library on my iPod, of 18 gigs or whatever it is video game music, right? So obviously I like Chrono Trigger music, but my reason for saying that is Chrono Trigger, the soundtrack, the 4 soundtracks, it's been in 4 separate albums over the course of the years, is actually widely known. in popular media. It's something that people are aware of. It's something that most people consider to be one of the better soundtracks of all time. I disagree personally, but moving on. So, that's worth noting. It's also worth noting, I'm sorry, I have to divulge for a second, that Yasunori Matsuda is probably one of the worst composers I've ever heard, not counting this, because when he no longer had Nobuo Uematsu sitting over his shoulder, he made Chrono Cross and Xenogears, and I actually don't know what else, but both of those were terrible soundtracks. I actually played most of Xenogears with my TV muted, because I couldn't bear to listen to it. But I'm not here to talk about that. The music in Chrono Trigger is nothing short of fantastic. I would be hard-pressed to think of a song I actually dislike in Chrono Trigger, and there are some of the best songs I've ever heard in Chrono Trigger, including, obviously a couple that Nobuo Uematsu himself did, but for the most part, I certainly give it props there. The graphics is something else that they really hadn't tried before in any real extent. They had probed and experimented with the Seiken Densetsu series, Final Fantasy Adventure and Secret of Mana, but actually, I guess Secret of Mana hadn't been out yet, but they were moving in that general direction. But what they wanted was, instead of the super deformed graphics, which both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy employed at the time, they wanted something a little bit more. They wanted something a little bit more animated, with greater motion, and so they tried this two-sprite system, which ended up working out beautifully. And if you don't know the details, I'm not going to bother boring you with it, but the point is, what it made for was more space, more detail that you could put into it. You could really pull out a lot more animations and emotions and expressions within the characters when they were the two-sprite system rather than the super deformed little thing, right? And it worked out really well. Obviously, the graphics in Chrono Trigger, especially for a SNES game, are nothing short of fantastic. In fact, I would argue the graphics in Chrono Trigger are better than most of the graphics in games that preceded it, followed it in the PlayStation era. And even to some extent in the PlayStation 2 era. Now, yeah, it's obviously pixelated art, but it's extremely well done pixelated art, and it is pixelated art. It's actually, there's really a lot of effort and detail put into it. And you walk into an inn whose only purpose is to talk to 3 NPCs and occasionally go stop at the end in order to sleep, and you could look in the background and see a ridiculous amount of detail back there. They really put their effort into it, so props. And because of the larger system, they had more space to do that. They could actually show that that's a basket full of tomatoes. They could show that that's a boar on the fire, and so forth and so on. It really worked out well. They also really managed to pull off the variety. And what I mean by that is each era feels fairly distinct from the others. Even between 680 and 1080, the overall feel between the two is nonetheless quite dissimilar and pulls off its own distinct flavor, which is really well done, I think, and really props to it. Obviously, 2300 looks completely different, and 65 million BC looks completely different, but you get the general concept. Each of the eras feels like a portion of that era, which is used for dramatic effect in the story when you encounter something in an era that is from a previous era. Like when you come across the remains of the Toronto lair in 680, or when you come across the remains of Zeal in 2380, it's actually a noticeable, jarring, even difference, done for the effect of giving you the impression that this is something that does not belong here. This is something that's out of place, right? Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the story, because the story of Chrono Trigger is actually fairly well developed. It's hard to go back and appreciate it as a new game these days, because I've played Chrono Trigger more than I've played any other game ever, because of the new Game Plus system, which I'll go into later. And so I know that game inside and out better than I know any other game, and it's worth noting that it's hard to capture that new feeling. Remember when everyone thought Magus actually was the source of Lavos, and everyone thought that was the last dungeon. Remember when we really didn't know what was going on in 65 million BC. We remember when we really had no idea what the Kingdom of Zeal was, and blah 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 blah. All these things are hard to capture anymore, but they're still there and they're still present, and the story is still very well crafted, very well constructed, especially given the themes thing, which I'll get into in a little bit. But the dialogue in the old SNES version had some issues. I'm not going to lie about you. That's the Ted Woolsey era, and no offense to the man, none whatsoever. He did a good job with what he had. But it is noticeable that there are certain things that just don't quite make sense, and some things that you just kind of have to go with. And it's just like, why is that like that? The recent DS remake, one of the biggest things they did was retranslate the whole thing by Tom Slattery, which did a fantastic job. Most notably, the people in 680 talk like they should, rather than "ye olde they speak a." And Frog actually talks like a real person instead of thou and thee, just to use two examples right there. Maybe that's better or worse, is up to you. But the point is, the dialogue, the writing, the story, the character development, let's go into that. The character development of Chrono Trigger is certainly significant. They pull off something that, excuse me, most RPGs of the era didn't really do. Final Fantasy VI was ironically the other one to do this. It's the ensemble cast idea. Most RPGs had a main character who had a lot of plot development and a lot of character development, a lot of story involvement, and then you had the secondary characters who had development and had character growth, but it was only secondary. It was always noticeably secondary. Whereas in Chrono Trigger, Chrono himself ironically gets no character development, being the poster child of, well, actually no, being the second poster child of silent protagonist syndrome. But the first one's being Link, by the way. But every other character has not just their moment in the spotlight, but several moments in the spotlight, and each other character has a solid, defined reason for being part of the party and has a vested interest in the progress of what you're trying to do and the defeat of Lavos and the saving of the timeline. And every character has several moments, and I shouldn't even call them moments, several scenes, several sections, several whole chunks of the game devoted to them and their growth and their understanding of who they are and what they are and why they want to be. Every single one of them. And it works out really well. Some people might argue Magus does not get the kind of development that does, but I would argue completely against that. He gets a ton of development. It's just most of the time he's not in the party when he's getting it. And you really get to understand where he's coming from. And in fact, basically his story is more or less played out by the time he finally joins the party, at which point he joins you for all the reasons you already learned, because you've already learned about this character. You've watched him go through his life and his ways and days and his falls and his defeats and his triumphs. And so, excuse me, character development is definitely on tops in this game, and it really pulls off the ensemble feels to the point where, other than the obvious answer of Chrono, picking a main character is difficult to do, if not downright impossible. Now, one other thing I praise the game for is something else that Final Fantasy VI basically pulled off, and that's that there's no real romance. I know that sounds weird, because a properly done romance is not a bad thing in an RPG. But too many RPGs, especially of the era, and actually this is true to this day, feel the need to shoehorn in a love interest. This is your love interest because either she's the only female character, or she's the only one who looks like that, if you know what I mean. Or whatever. There's always some kind of... It feels forced. It feels unnecessary. It feels like it has to be tacked on. There has to be a love story in the game. And this was true back then as well. It wasn't as forced back in the old era. In Final Fantasy IV, Cecil and Rosa were together before the game even started. However, in Final Fantasy VI, all you ever got was hints between Rosa and Locke. Now, everyone that I've ever talked to ever has obviously said that's going to happen, of course. But it's the same thing in Chrono Trigger. You get hints between Marle and between Chrono, and that's all it ever is hints. It never goes past that point, and I like that. I like the fact that they, in the middle of this literally world-destroying conflict that is involving the fate of time itself, that they don't bother to shoehorn in a romance story just because they had to. I like that, so that's props there. Now, next thing to talk about is the hybrid nature of the game. I've already talked about this to some extent, the two sprite system and the fact that it was a combined force of Enix and Square that made the game. But what I really mean is it's hard to explain really, because Chrono Trigger is a tragedy, and it is, but it also has in the exact same game, and sometimes in the exact same scene, moments of genuine silly humor. And I don't know how to explain it better than that. I personally like silly humor, this particular type of humor I'm referring to. It's not childish, that's a difference. It's just lighthearted and bubbly and just, like the Pokemons, or like several of the Dragon Quests, or like Earthbound are examples I could throw out here of games that are just, or the Mario RPGs. They're just silly, they're just fun, they're just like, and they have that sense of humor in the same scene. The perfect example of this is Ozzy of the Mystic Trio, or the Fiends, Lords, Generals, or whatever you want to call him. And he is basically a bumbling, inept sidekick who's inflated self-importance, blah, 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 who also happens to be a necromancer who raises the dead of your fallen companions right in front of you in order to fight you. That dichotomy is right there in the same scene, even. You get this thing, Ozzy's in a pickle, and he runs away, and you can practically hear the Zoidberg noise from Futurama as he's like, whoop, 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 whoop. And then he raises some more dead to come after you, and it's really weird how Chrono Trigger pulls it off and actually manages it, because it is a game that's hard to describe as lighthearted, but at the same time hard to describe as too heavy. And that's a mix that modern games tend to not get. Most modern games tend to be so down and in dust and, oh god, everything's doomed. Dragon Age would be an excellent example. Good game, fantastic game. But Dragon Age, it has humor here now and again, but for the most part, Dragon Age is a very dreary, very depressing, very oppressing game that's all about the seriousness of the situation, right? If I'm not even sure a game like Chrono Trigger could really sell these days because of the sheer efforts at humor that are constantly there. Like a game like Earthbound. I don't even know if it would do it all these days. But moving along, that's just one example of the hybrid nature. The combat system was like a halfway between. It is menu-based combat when it gets down to it, but they really went out of their way to make it feel like it was action-based, more like the Secret of Mana or the far more well-known Zelda style of combat, where you're actually swinging your sword around doing your thing. And all the animations really make it look like that's what it's happening, especially with the active time battle system that they used, which is pretty much copy-paste from the more modern Final Fantasy systems. But it really pulls off a rather smooth experience, and combat in Chrono Trigger is turn-based, but it is so quick and it's so smooth and it's so effortless that it really doesn't feel like it. And the boss fights, as a result of this pacing and a result of this action, really feel like boss fights. You really feel like you're facing a monstrosity, and every time you face a new boss, it's like, oh goodness, you hear the music prop up and it's like, alright, I'm ready. Oh my goodness. And especially on your first playthrough, if you're not leveling particularly much, like I usually don't, you'll actually have several points where you're fighting a boss that is beating the crap out of you, and you're actually having a really hard time with, and it's awesome because every time it happens, it's with a boss that's significant for story reasons, which is another thing that RPGs in general need to do more of, in my opinion. When you're fighting Magus for the first time, that's a hard fight because it's the Fiend Lord, and technically supposed to be the last boss, even though you don't realize that at the time if you're playing it for new. I'm sorry, by the way, I'm spoiling the heck out of the plot. I do apologize, but this is Chrono Trigger. If I'm spoiling the game like this at this point, then I don't know what to tell you. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the scope of the game is really hard to take in without really taking a step back and looking at it. The game really gets into paradoxes quite a bit, obviously, for a time travel game, and it does it properly. It does it correctly. I'll give you one very good example of this. The whole crisis began, because the party interfered with the conflict between the humans and the reptites way back in 65 million BC, right? And as a result of that, the reptites became desperate, forged the Black Chrono, then you go and stop them in the Black Chrono, and then the reptiles become even more desperate, and Azula, with the last bit of her strength, pulls down Lavos, who is passing by the planet at that point, into the world. Now, that's relevant because Lavos' tremendous energy and the combination of Lavos and Shala at the end of time, or I'm sorry, beyond time, is what's causing these time portals to exist in the first place in the world, right? It's also especially, well, you know what, I'm going to get into that fate thing a little bit later, but it's relevant because the reason the party traveled through time was because the time portals that Lavos created, because they went through time in order to drag him back, in order to create... You get the idea. It's very circular. It's very properly set up. That is a predestination paradox as in a nutshell. And again, done properly. That's exactly how it should be. And it's really a chilling moment, admittedly, after playing, however many hours, 10 hours, 12 hours into the game, and you suddenly see in 65 million BC, which up until now has had no hint or sign of Lavos or anything like it, and this giant fire starts coming down from the sky, and you hear Isla say, oh, call it Lavos, and it's like, what? And there's this beautiful song playing. It's not epic. It's not, oh my god, everything's in heaven. It's very quiet and somber and sad, and it's just this little tune that's playing, showing this is when the world ends, right here. This is when it all begins, and you really get a feel for that. And there are so many other instances in the game. That's my personal favorite, obviously. But one of the other things I like is they are very consistent with their approach to time travel, which is good. Whenever any given game, video, TV, movie, book, whatever, is doing time travel, they need to be consistent with their own rules of time travel, in my opinion. One example of this not being done properly would be Doctor Who, as much as I hate to speak poorly of Doctor Who, because I'm a fan of Doctor Who. But they tend to kind of bounce around which rules work which way, based on whoever's writing it or whichever series they're in. In Chrono Trigger, it's all fairly static. The people doing the time traveling are unaffected utterly by the changes they are making to history, which is good for obvious reasons. It's basically required actually for the game to function. But that stays static for the whole time. They are themselves no matter what. There's also another thing which I like to call the Bill and Ted concept. There's actually a trope for it, which is San Dimas time, I believe. What that means is if you'll picture time like this, and it's all going around here, and you're up here in 2300 AD, and something is happening back here in 1000 AD, and if you go back, let's say as you're going, 5 minutes have passed, right? Just one little tick here. When you go back, you don't go back to the same spot. You go back to 5 minutes from the previous time when you were there, if you follow me. What I mean by this is time overall is flowing in a general fashion. So, to use an example, this is artificial, but to get the point across, if the Kiros reached 2300 AD at 1 a.m., and they spent 3 days in 2300 AD doing their thing, and then they went back to 1000 AD, the 1000 AD they'd be going back to would be 3 days from the 1000 AD they left, if you follow me. And that remains static throughout the whole thing. And again, that's basically required for the game to function, but they do keep with it the whole time, so props there. They do put a lot of thought into that sort of thing, which I really do like, especially the level of detail that goes into the intricacies of the whys and the wherefores in the story. There are a lot of fairly subtle points which were explored in the worst game ever made, Chrono Cross. Sorry, I really do not like Chrono Cross, but I don't want to get into that here. But there was a lot of subtle points that were placed out in Chrono Trigger that were left for the viewer, the gamer, to determine for themselves and to think about for themselves. So there's a great deal to think about, and I like a game that encourages you to think about it as you're playing it, or after you've played it. Now, I said I was going to talk about the fate thing. And my reason for that is I want to talk about that in terms of scope. See, most Dragon Quest games and Final Fantasy games up until then, and to now, really, have a centralized theme that the overall game is about, right? This one theme that the whole game ties into. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, I want to stress that for a moment. But it's something they've kept to for quite a long time, and it's worked for them, and blah, blah, blah. You know, just to use an example, Final Fantasy VII has the nature versus alien concept with Genova, the planet, the life stream, all that stuff, right? And they go into great detail over it. Chrono Trigger has 5 themes, I believe. Now, you could probably split these up even more, but I think 5 is an even number, even though it's not an even number, to settle on for this. The primary, it's hard to say which one's the primary, and that's kind of my point, is that each of these 5 themes is well integrated to the story, is intricately relevant, not just to the story, but to the characters in the story, and has something to do with the individuals. This is, like I've said with my Final Fantasy VI review, this is a game that makes you care about the characters, and part of that is because each one of these themes ties into each individual character at some point or another, or indeed throughout the whole piece. Let's start with time. That may sound like the obvious one, but I don't mean time as in time travel, or I don't mean time as the thought process of time and the end of time and all that. No, no, no. There's a very undercurrent of time is precious throughout all of Chrono Trigger, and in several instances, most strongly within the case of Magus and Luca, I would say, and Marl, there is a very strong feeling, a strong sense of, how do I put it? Enjoy it while it lasts. Enjoy these moments because they will never come again. And savor the experience of being in that moment so you can remember it in the future. And there's a very strong sense of, you know, valuing each second, each day, each year of your life and making the most of it, making the best of it. Sorry about that. Got another phone call. I'm just busy all over the place tonight, aren't I? And to continue with my thing, as I mentioned, it has to do with the characters, but that goes beyond the main characters too. There are many NPCs, and some of them aren't even named. Some of them are. You know, some of them are the main NPCs as part of the story. But there's a this is probably the strongest undercurrent that hits all of the non-player characters throughout the story, is that of time being precious and of trying to make the most of everything you have while you still have it. This is especially true in the Kingdom of Zeal. Comes to mind immediately, or 65 million BC, to a strange degree. You know, live for the now and do the best you can because tomorrow may not come. Kind of a deal in the 65 million BC sense. And you get the general concept, right? Now, the second theme is that of fate. I'm trying to think of how to best describe this, because there's 2 ways to think of 2 layers to think of this as. One is obviously the fact that is the question, is there fate? Is it something that we can change, or is it something that we are predestinated to? I'd call it the Matrix question, but that seems being crass for a little bit. But you get the idea. Several works of fiction in all forms of media have approached this question. Is there a fate that we cannot deviate from, or are we able to challenge it and do what we can in order to change it, in order to fix it? And obviously that question is very central to the plot of the game, because what you're trying to do is change fate, because technically it already happened. Lavos already won. He already destroyed the planet. He already spent the 65 million years cultivating every form of life on the planet for his ends, and was about to leave with his spawn. It was over, right? It was done. And so what you're trying to do is change that, and obviously the thought process there is you can change fate. But there's a second layer to this to think about, and that is ignoring Chrono Cross. Let's just ignore that entirely for a minute, because it's just one whole ball of mess that I don't even want to get into. Ignoring Chrono Cross, it is worth noting that it seems like there is a fated way that things are supposed to be. Now, this is debatable, and I like this, because there is no definitive answer here, ignoring Chrono Cross. Because you could say that, yes, there is a definitive fate, because everything I mentioned before about the 65 million BC incident, you, the characters, start the plot because of your interference with prehistory. You do it. And you did it trying to alter history. And, predestination paradox. You're the one who started this whole mess. And it is very strongly implied that none of this would have happened if you hadn't, again, paradox, but you get the general concept, right? If you had never gone back to 65 million BC, it's very possible none of this would have happened. I'll get into more into the significance of that in a moment, but my point is, even within the concept of changing fate, it feels like it was fated to be changed. It feels like you were fated to undergo this great journey, to experience all these different timelines, as is mentioned explicitly later in the game, I might add, and to stop Lavos in order to save the world. Now, the reason I say this is debatable is it's very possible that this wasn't fated, that in fact fate was that Lavos was supposed to win, and that you were supposed to travel through time and fail, and blah blah blah, but that somebody, well, I'm going to take that back. The point being that somebody, Shala, with her merging with the Time Devourer, intentionally encouraged you and guided you and pushed you through this path throughout the different timelines, so you could see all the different timelines, so you could gain the understanding you needed, so you could grow in power necessary in order to change fate. And thus, it isn't actually fate, it is her, specifically and individually, begging, pleading, desperately wanting you to save this world. And I personally think I subscribe to that idea personally. I like that idea. I like how it plays out, and it seems to fit in my opinion, because the concept of the other themes of the game flow more connectedly with the fact that fate can be changed rather than with the fact that it can't. And so that's another reason I think it would complete the piece as a whole. The third thing I want to talk about, like I said, is the nature thing, the significance. Now, it is implied extensively, this has gone on to more in Chrono Cross, but whatever, it is implied extensively that the 65 million BC disasters, plural, wouldn't have happened without your input. I mean, obviously it wouldn't happen, but you get my point. It is implied several times that the humans and the reptiles would have, at some point, learn to coexist. The reptiles would stop trying to enslave or destroy the humans. The humans would learn to work with the reptiles and learn with them. And the two forces would join together, and that's what should have happened. That was what was natural, if you follow me. That was the natural course of events. This is tying back into that FF7 thing I told you earlier about. The concept of nature versus alien. In FF7, it was Genova, which was alien, and the life stream and the planet, which was natural. And in this case, it's the planet as a whole is natural, and Lavos and everything derived and from him is alien. Now, I want to define this really quick, because I want to get this point across. Too many people use the word alien and don't really understand the significance of the word. The word alien is meant to imply something that is so violently different and disparage it from what it is you're defining, in this case humanity or natural order or whatever, that it does not fit and can only be defined by the word alien. It can only be defined by the word other, It does not fit within these set parameters. It does not fit within this category. And that is what Lavos is in a very strong, very impacting way. He is truly an alien entity. an entity of such inhuman and unnatural sort that he cannot be compared to anything on the planet of any type, of any sort. And obviously, and this is stated implicitly in the game and has hinted at constantly throughout the game, the course of the entire world, of human development, of societal progress, all of that, magic itself came from Lavos. The technology that people learned came from Lavos. All these things were orchestrated by Lavos on purpose, because he was trying to cultivate a perfect set of DNA in order to A, become the ultimate life form, and B, in order to be a parasite, to take all the life of the planet and then to leave. And when 1999 hit, he was like, all right, I've gotten everything I wanted. Let's blow the world up, wipe the plate clean, and get ready to leave. And he spent the next 300 years preparing to send, procreating, creating the lava spawn, and preparing to leave the planet. And so this whole nature versus alien thing comes into play in many cases. The whole war between the humans and the mystics, or fiends, depending on your preference, in 600 AD has tones and shades of natural versus alien. And at first you might think the obvious one, and is the one you are given the impression of, that humans are the natural and that mystics are the aliens. But as you learn more about it, and as the game progresses, you realize it's actually the other way around. The humans are the aliens in this environment. The mystics were the ones who rose up against the humans and against their oppression and against the alien invaders that were the humanity, right? And it's really interesting the way they pull that off, and really well done. And this theme is seen several times throughout the whole of the game. The Mother Brain, for example, at 2300, points this out pretty much specifically and says Lavos and what it would be able to do, trying to state that Lavos itself, is actually the natural order and that everything else is the alien. And that is actually one of the ways they show that the Mother Brain is insane, has completely lost her mind, and is obviously wrong, at least from the point of the game, if you follow me, and so forth and so on. It's really well done, and it's really integrated to the plot very well. Excuse me. What am I up to? That was fate, nature, and time, right? So the next point would be tragedy. As I mentioned before, with the sole exception of the ending, Chrono Trigger is very much a tragic game. It is very much categorized as a tragedy. The only reason it isn't a true tragedy is it does have a happy ending. And it's one of those, there's a trope for that. It's called earn your happy ending, and Chrono Trigger has that in spades. You really do have to work for it. Every time you think you've gotten somewhere, things get worse. Every time you think you've made another step in advance, you get pushed 4 steps back. The whole game is you struggling against a constant stream of adversity as everything is pushing you back. I mean, watch the progression of the game. You lose Marl, right? So you go back in time and you find out, oh shoot, she's about to be erased from existence and put into the dead zone, or whatever it's called. So, okay, we have to go save her. Okay, we saved her. Alright, we get back home and we're immediately accused of kidnapping her. Okay, fine, whatever, we have to escape from prison and deal with that. Okay, whatever, we run into the future where we find out the world is destroyed. And believe it or not, it keeps escalating from that point, from the point of learning of the world's destruction 300 years previous to then. My personal favorite example of this is the lead up to the Ocean Palace, which is the second final boss fake-out. The first one being Magus in the Magus's lair. The whole of the Ocean Palace feels very much like a last boss fight. You were going after Zeal, you were going after her, she's trying to summon Lavos, and as an experienced gamer, you're probably thinking, well, she's going to succeed, and we're going to have to fight Lavos, and that's going to be it. And she does succeed, and then Lavos destroys you, and annihilates Magus, who is there waiting to do his thing, and drains the hell out of his powers, and it all goes to pot so fast. The gurus are flung through time. Janus is flung through time to become Magus, again, nice little paradox loop there. You guys are barely able to escape. Chrono dies, sort of. He doesn't actually. His doll dies, but you don't know that at the time. All you know is that everything has just gone to hell. And then Lavos unleashes his wrath, sends the entire kingdom of Zeal plummeting to the ground, killing I don't even know how many. Assuming this is actually a world view we're talking about, that was actually the floating continent which consisted of most of the population of the planet, I would assume that that is millions of people who just died horribly. And, oh my god, that's actually probably the final real tragedy, because after that it really gets down to the end game. But you get the general concept. The whole game is built around this concept of tragedy, of things of the revelation. And when I say tragedy, I say that specifically. It's not just things going bad. Tragedy isn't things going bad. Tragedy is more than that. Tragedy is lifting up and building up and working up and then falling. Tragedy is something that is constructed. It is a art form, to be quite honest with you, and if pulled off properly, it can really pull at you. It can really touch your heartstrings, and it does in Chrono Trigger. You watch these people struggle and strive, and okay, we've got this, and there's hopeful music playing, and then BAM! And no matter how many times it keeps happening, you keep hoping that this time maybe we'll succeed. And then you don't, you know? And one of my favorite implements of that tragedy, it's a very simple scene. It's when you go to 2300 AD after being locked out of the 12,000 BC era by Shala, and who was being coerced to do so. And you find Balthasar's lab, Balthasar himself having already passed away at this point. And as you go through, this really simple, quiet, sad song is playing as you start reading his log, going through the room, telling about his fate and how his own mind is going and how this world is already doomed and there is really only one chance, and I have spent all my efforts and all my dreams on this one possibility of fixing this gigantic mess that has become of this world. And please, for the love of God, please, you who opened the doors of time, take my final invention, my wings of time. And it's really a moving scene for me. Every time I watch that scene, I get a little misty-eyed because it's just so indicative of the overall plot and why that tragedy theme really moves throughout the game. Excuse me. Now, as I said, there's a fifth theme here, and I'm trying to think of a way to call this because it's not hope. It really isn't. The Chrono Trigger is not a hopeful game. You do have a great deal of hope in Chrono Trigger, but it is always dashed. It is always crushed. Chrono Trigger has a slightly different tone and feel to it as far as this theme goes, and I think what I want to call it is refusal. It is the refusal to give up. It's not just hope. Hope is just, someday things may get better. No. This is, I don't care how bad things are. I don't care that I am living off of scraps and unable I'm so atrophied because my body is eating itself because I don't have any food that I can barely move. No. I'm not giving up. I am not surrendering. I am going to keep trying and I'm going to keep going even if it means my death. That refusal, that yell, that shout of defiance in the face of absolute unspeakable odds. That is the theme I'm going to, and I would arguably say probably the most powerful theme of the many, because that's what starts the whole thing. When you get to 2300 AD and you find out, that the world has been destroyed and Lavos has killed everything, and there's just this moment of, what could we possibly do? You have to understand at this point in time, Chrono, Marl, and Luca don't know magic, don't have any particular skills worthy of note. They're probably like level 8. You're nothing. You're nobody at this point in time. And in story-wise, that is also true. They still hadn't gained any real significant power by this point in time. And so they're just staring at this scene like, how could we possibly do this? And Luca is just... And, Chrono obviously doesn't say anything. And Marl yells. She says, no, this is not how the future is going to end. We're going to go back and we're going to change it. And I want you to understand that this is 3 children who have just vowed to save the world from a planet-destroying alien the size of a city. That right there is the essence of this theme, and it's prevalent throughout the whole of the game. I mean, because it also represents the flip side of the coin, because there are quite a few individuals, usually NPCs, sometimes main characters, who have given up that sense of defiance, that sense of resistance to the horrible tragedy that happened. I'll give you probably the most potent example I can think of off the top of my head is the fact that there are completely nameless, completely unlabeled NPCs in the 2300 Mother Factory, in the Protodome Factory, who are sitting on a conveyor belt because they have lost the will to do anything other than sit there and accept the fate that awaits them. And in case you're wondering where that conveyor belt leads, well, we're kind of left to the imagination, but the scream that happens off camera kind of gives it away, I think. And that's the kind of atmosphere we get on the other side of the coin, is the people who have truly given up, who have truly just have nothing left to live for, and just, it's over, and there's no reason to try. And we split that with the dichotomy of the people who, even knowing there is no hope, even knowing that this isn't going to work, even knowing that they are facing odds that are uncountable, they're going to keep trying. And in many cases, it results in, not pleasant circumstance. It results in them failing. It results in them dying. But they stand nonetheless. I'll give you my perfect example of that side of the coin is Cyrus, when he's facing Magus, and he is wounded, and he is bleeding, and he's standing there, and he says, Glenn, run, just run, take care of the queen. And he grabs his sword, and he charges Magus full on. Even knowing there is absolutely no way he's ever going to injure him, he still does it. And it's not just, don't give me that he's just doing it for his friend Glenn, because he is. He is trying to help his friend Glenn. But he is doing it because he, as an individual, as a knight, as a man of honor, refuses to give up, even in the face of absolute defeat. And he does die for this fact. But he died on his feet, if you know what I mean. He died fighting. And that would be the final theme, and like I said, in my opinion, one of the most powerful themes of the piece that is prevalent throughout the entirety of the game. Excuse me. My apologies, I meant to mention this in my original review, and I got sufficiently flustered because about the point I was going to mention it was when I got called, and I just kind of kept going with the themes process. But there's one other thing I really do feel I must discuss with regards to Chrono Trigger, and that is something Chrono Trigger more or less invented. It's a feature that, in my opinion, should be in every single RPG ever made, and I'm not kidding when I say that. That feature is called New Game Plus. Now, the way it works kind of varies, kind of differs based on which game is implementing it and how. The way Chrono Trigger did it is after you've unlocked the New Game Plus feature, which varies based on which edition you're playing, but usually you have to have beaten the game at some point in time, you are able to, at the main menu, instead of saying New Game, say New Game Plus, and load an existing save game. Now, what you will load from that save game is all your levels, all your techs, all your inventory, with the exception of key items. No, no plot skipping stuff here. And I don't believe you load your gold, but I think gold and plot items are actually all you don't load. Everything else goes forward with you. That also includes stats, specifically, if you use capsules and stuff like that affect your stats. And of course, all your equipment, obviously, as part of your inventory. And so, I don't even have words to express how incredible of an idea it is. There's a reason Chrono Trigger is my most played game ever, because I would just keep New Game Plusing over and over and over to play through the game. So few games have the options that New Game Plus allows you. Like, for example, just to use one example from my past, let's say you've hit a certain point, you're going through an initial playthrough, and you're having trouble getting through that point, and you have an option. You can go back and grind, or you can New Game Plus the save game at that point. Say you're level 15, which is what I was at the time. Alright, I'm level 15. New Game Plus, start over the game at level 15, and by the time you get to that point, you're at level like 20 or something like that, because you've just played through the game again, and it also adds something. So many games, I think I've mentioned this before, FF7 is the worst offender here. So many games have the problem of having all the good stuff at the end, right? And Chrono Trigger is actually no exception to this. Most of the good gear in the original version was in the Black Omen, and all the good gear in the new DS version is in the super optional Dimensional Vortex dungeons. And, of course, the Sanctum stuff, but, And all of that is, well, good and fine, except for the fact that that means you never get to play around with all the best toys, if you know what I mean. FF7 is the worst about this, because, you get all the really good materia, which you could do all sorts of new combos and fun stuff with, and then you go and kill Sephiroth and the game's over. In Chrono Trigger, and other games with New Game Plus, you get all the new shiny stuff, and then you start the game over with all the new shiny stuff, and you actually get to play around with it and enjoy it. And it, in my opinion, makes it worth getting. Most of the time when I'm in a game like that, like FF7, I don't bother getting the super materia or the super items anymore, because there's no point. You get it, and then you beat the last boss. Okay. It just feels so pointless to me. To be able to actually get it and enjoy it, that's completely different. And in fact, one of the things I coined quite a while ago is what I call the pseudo New Game Plus, because I feel every RPG should have this feature, and many don't. Final Fantasy X is a game I did this several times with, should have New Game Plus, given how much time and effort you can put into that sphere grid. And so what I'd do is I'd use Game Genie or Game Shark or Codebreaker or whatever I happen to have and cheat in such a way to give myself some of the things I would have from a New Game Plus, and then I could actually enjoy it as though I was New Game Plus in the game, if you follow me. And I honest to God believe any RPG ever made would benefit from this option, but there's one other thing I want to discuss really briefly that I was just reminded of. The DS version of the game is the version I recommend, not just because it polishes it, not just because it adds to the overall experience, not just because of the fact that they redid the battle engine, not just because of the fact that all the dialogue was rewritten. No. They added brand new content, which is more or less expected. And while the dimensional vortexes are relatively short and fairly challenging and involve their own specific challenges and whatnot, those are fun and interesting, and several of them have dialogue options. But what really impressed me about the DS version is the Lost Sanctum. I'm trying to think of how best to describe this, because the Lost Sanctum is effectively completely unconnected to the plotline as a whole, right? It has nothing to do with the story. It's in fact the only part of the game that doesn't. Every other thing, including the dimensional vortexes, have something to do with the primary plotline and the Lavos and the time and all that stuff, right? The Lost Sanctum has nothing to do with it. It is a completely separate game, but it's worth noting that you actually have quests, if you could call them that. You know, you have things you go and undertake. You have rather large zones. There's no actual overworld map. Instead, there are very large zones that are all connected to each other. You know, there's the forest, and over here is the dungeon, and the dungeon's the fortress, and over here is the swamp, and up there is the mountain, and up there's the mountain top. You get the general concept, right? And so it creates a feeling of a second world, a smaller world, to be assured, but certainly a fairly large world in its own right. And the plot, there is a separate plot that is going through that other sanctum, that other series of things, and it just kind of grows and develops as you go. And all this is fantastic. It's wonderful. It's new gameplay with the same mechanics. You know, it's Chrono Trigger 1.5. You know, but the thing that really impresses me is how long it is. There is actually astonishingly large amount of content in the Lost Sanctum. It kind of keeps going, and the story keeps evolving, and it keeps unveiling, and it's really well done, and I really enjoyed it. And I highly recommend, if you have a choice between the SNES or the DS version, you get the DS version, because if nothing else, you know, ignoring all the other things which improve on the game in every single possible aspect, this single thing, the addition of the Lost Sanctum, is very worth it. So, now to get back to my final summary here. All of these facts combined weave a tapestry of, like I said, it's a hybrid game. It's little bits of this, little bits of that, and all of it works beautifully. Chrono Trigger is nothing short of a work of art. It is nothing short of a fantastic game, and if you were to ask me which two games should I play, this would be one of them, without question, without hesitation, without reservation. There are people who don't like RPGs who have enjoyed Chrono Trigger, and I do recommend it. And I apologize if I have spoiled many of the plot threads of this game if you've never played it. But bottom line, Chrono Trigger on my list of 1 to 10, actually negative 10 to 10, gets an astonishing 11 out of 10 for being so far beyond the top and above that it deserves better than simple calculation. Chrono Trigger literally takes it to 11 and is nothing short of a fantastic game. I really don't know how better to put that.